Okay, here we go with chapter 5. And so here are the goals that you will have for this chapter. Hopefully at the end of this chapter you'll be able to answer all of these questions. And so here we go. First of all, the development of sensory, perceptual, and motor functions is the first developmental task. The important terms, first of all, when you look at this neuron, you see it's a typical neuron. The message comes in through the dendrites, goes through the soma or cell body, goes down the axon, goes down to the axon terminals, where then it will come to a synapse and then go to the dendrites of another neuron. Along the axon, there's what is called the myelin sheath, which is made up of glial cells, which not only provides insulation and nourishment, but also speeds up the message down an axon. Neuroplasticity is probably the greatest thing that's been discovered with neurons, as it once was believed that they were static, and once they were destroyed or killed or in some way, that it was over. But now we know that actually neurons are quite responsive to learning, to the environment. Right now, hopefully your neurons are sprouting little connections based on this little lesson that you're getting. It also can be very important when there's damage due to disease or injury of some sort, that other parts of the brain will take over for the parts of the brain that have been injured. Or rendered ineffective. It's just like, even in a radical sense, a left hemispherectomy is a person that has epileptic seizures that are generated in the left hemisphere. They take the left hemisphere out of the brain, which then you would think that the person would never speak again, but then the right brain takes over and they can talk quite well. People that have strokes, they used to believe that they would never regain the use of their appendages and so forth that have been affected, but now they can through plasticity. So the brain is more malleable than once thought. Transcendent exuberance is just that there's these times where there's just an explosion of growth in the neurons, and then what happens is they have to be refined or pruned down, just like you would prune a plant so that the parts of the plant that you want to grow, the flowers of the fruit, have room to grow. So that becomes important in early childhood development, but also we'll find out in adolescence. Here's the synapse, where there's a presynaptic membrane and a postsynaptic membrane, and they're semi-permeable. There's vesicles that hold neurotransmitters. Those chemicals that are going to take the message from one neuron to another, because neurons aren't butted up against each other. There's this little space between them. So the message has to be carried from one neuron to the other. This is done by neurotransmitters. So you hear about serotonin, you hear about dopamine, these types of neurotransmitters. The vesicles are the holding point or parts, and then the receptor sites are where those neurotransmitters will be received into the other neuron. These are like a key and a lock. Okay, serotonin can't go into dopamine receptors and so forth, so they match up, just like you can't use the key to your car to get in your house. Same principle. Now, there's another thing that I just want to talk very briefly about here is, yes, we talk so much about neurons, but there are other cells that are starting to gain more interest in the brain, and these are called glial cells, which stands for glue, or which means glue, and they make up actually 85% of the cells in the brain, far more numerous than neurons. There's these 4 types that we're going to cover, and I'm going to go through these very, very quickly, because this isn't a class to talk about this too much. But there's Schwann cells that are found in the peripheral nervous system. They have the myelin, and they're found in 3 different forms in the peripheral nervous system, so you can stop this and take a look at them. The next would be oligodendrocytes, which means stubby dendrites or short branches, and these are found in the central nervous system, and they look like an octopus, and their tentacles go out and wrap around the neuron, and that's where the myelin comes from. Um, Astrocytes are there for kind of damage control in a lot of ways, but also structure. You can see here it's aiding in the transmission of a neural message. But also they come and they clear out waste and they form scars once the brain has been injured. If they start to break down, it can create some pretty severe consequences. Microglia are kind of the soldiers or guards. They're there to help protect the neurons, and there's one for every neuron, and they can perform their protective types of chores in several different ways. And again, you can stop this and take a look at it. All the parts of the brain are starting to develop. However, it's kind of developing from bottom up, and the frontal lobe is going to take much longer to develop. So the thinking processes and the higher thinking processes take a little bit longer to develop, but you can stop this again and take a look at this, and this diagram's in your book. One of the functions is hearing. Okay, it's soothed by the heartbeat. The child is soothed by the mother's voice. It's soothed more if she's bilingual, if she speaks in her native language. If mom listens to a particular type of music while the child is still in the womb, the child will actually come out with a preference for that music. They start out, we're going to talk about babbling when we talk about language, but basically all babies babble in the same language, and then it turns into more of a preference in response to the native language that they're hearing on a daily basis. They do prefer vocalizations, even if they're animal vocalizations, over sounds that are produced by technology. Vision starts as we see a newborn is basically blind, and then even though they do have color vision, it becomes more and more refined. They can't see very far, and they can't see very much. It seems like they can see about a few inches in front of their face. And of course, this is often a detection of the caregivers. But pattern and movement detection start to grow. They start to understand patterns, and they understand the movement of those patterns, and they start to anticipate what's going to happen next. They do prefer faces, and they prefer faces to be constructed in a certain way, and this just shows that they prefer the top-heavy configuration, in other words, looking at the eyes, or what we would consider to be the eyes. And they found that even children can, first of all, one of the first things that they do process is faces. That's what they do look at. And they prefer them to have some type of configuration that looks like a face, like I said. And also you can actually even break up the parent's face, put it in pieces, and they'll recognize that. Taste develops actually while they're in the womb. They do differentiate between sweet, salty, bitter, and sour. They do prefer sweet and salty. What does mom prefer to eat during her pregnancy will actually play a role in what the child prefers when they come out. Sweet can help with pain. When they've given sweets to children before something that's going to be painful, the level of pain seems to be lower if they've had something sweet. Breastfed babies tend to be less picky about their foods, but also tastes definitely change over the lifetime. And I've had many mothers in my classes talk quite vividly about how they get their children to eat the food that they need to eat in very creative manners. Smell, definitely. Smell develops in the womb again. They recognize the smell of mom. They can differentiate her out and other caregivers that are around them. They do understand the smell of breast milk. They can smell strangers at about 3 months, so stranger wariness starts to develop. But smell also provides comfort and security because I smell mom, or I smell those caregivers that offer me that comfort and security. And definitely smell plays a role in what we like to eat. Touch is so powerful. Um, it develops that relationship, that attachment that we're going to talk about between primary caregiver and the infant. Kangaroo care is given to children, oftentimes premature children, and it offsets some of the cognitive and behavioral consequences of premature birth. They just take the newborn and put it on the chest of the caregiver, and so it can feel the touch and also hear the heartbeat. And it, and then of course they use touch to explore with both hands, and they use their mouth. So Freud was right, just had the wrong reason. It's just that our lips are very full of all kinds of sense receptors, one of the highest concentration of sense receptors. So of course they're going to use their fingers in their mouth because that's where the most sensory stimulation is going to come from. They're born with certain reflexes. Okay, so when we talk about motor movement, a lot of it's reflexive. You can stop and look at this. But one reflex that starts at birth, that is just merely a reflex, not a social response, is a smile. It's about 6 weeks when that turns into a social smile. So here's the motor developments, and you can again look at this. These are in your book, and it's looking at the first year of motor development. And then sensory motor intelligence, which is a Piaget term, the way that we process information, organize it, and use it. It's just simple motor routines, reaching, grabbing, these types of things. And so the child is learning through this and developing intellectually or cognitively. So we have, and when you look at this, you see primary circular reactions, secondary circular reactions, and tertiary circular reactions. All that means is repetitive behavior. Primary has to do with the infant, his or herself. So it has to do usually with some type of feeding type of routine. Secondary is something outside of themselves. In other words, they start to use objects and other people. They're looking for a response from another person when they throw something. They're looking for a response when they pull on a cord. Those types of, they've tied a string around a child's toe, and when they kick their foot, then they look at something rotating above their head. Okay, and so they start to tie that together with, okay, if I pull my foot, then I see things move. And then the last one would be like experimentation. So it would be like I give the child a drumstick and they beat the drum, but then they beat the dog, and then they beat the floor, and then they beat you, and they're experimenting with that. Okay, object permanence is a big thing. In other words, do things still exist when they're out of view? So if I take a toy and put it under a blanket, does the child turn away because it thinks it no longer exists, or do they lift the blanket up and look for it? Categorization becomes very important in language acquisition. Levels of processing theory says that it actually works its way where the child gradually develops a greater ability to pay attention, to process information, to remember that, to use representational skills, which is just like now I'm going to use this box and it's going to play the role of a table when I play. Communication is very important. Like I said, babbling is universal, and then it becomes specific. They're going to share objects as a way of communication. Intersubjectivity is usually called the cognitive triangle, and the child will point at something and you point at it, and now see we're thinking about and looking at the same thing. Gestures and language development. It seems like children that use their gestures and even are taught a sign language to develop linguistic skills a little bit earlier. The first words happen around 12 months. A hollow phrase would be a one-word sentence. In other words, mommy, ball, whatever. Attachment is the process through which people develop specific emotional bonds with other people. It's where we start to develop stranger anxiety and separation anxiety. So the 4 attachment styles you see here: secure attachment. The caregiver is, and these were all developed through The Strange Situation by Ainsworth. And secure is where the infant feels comfort and security with the primary caregiver. Insecure avoidant is, you see, where they don't pay attention to the caregiver at all. Resistant ambivalent, you can't really tell what they're doing. They're holding on, they're pushing away at the same time. They're overly emotional and disorganized would be something that we would see possibly in a child where there's maybe some type of mental disorder, or there's been drugs or alcohol or neglect involved. And here you can stop this and take a look at this. This is the pattern of behavior that happened in the strange situation, where the child was just introduced to a situation with their primary caregiver where there were toys, and then the stranger came in, and then the parent left, and the child was left with the stranger. Then the parent came back in, and then the stranger left, and then actually the child was left alone. And it was what they watched for was the reunion behaviors. In other words, how did the child respond when the mother came back in? They used mothers with these children, and also how they played while the caregivers were there. And so now you can look at this and again stop and look at the different types of attachment and what kind of led to that. And usually this leads to parenting styles that relates to secure, insecure types of attachments. Here's right out of your book, which you can again stop and take a look at this, which goes into the sensitivity, what's their experience, how does the caregiver feel about themselves, what's the child's characteristics, and then what do we believe about how children should be interacted with. And then here I'd like you to stop this and just take a look at how this plays out as life goes on. And this was done with studies done with people reflecting back on their own childhood. And temperament is basically my emotional responses to situations. And this is believed to be inborn. However, it can be definitely affected by, there's going to be some squishing here with, I'm sorry about that, with the child. Jerome Kagan did some of the most poignant studies on this, and he started out that it was purely an environmental type of situation, but then he came to believe that it was genetic, it was inborn, and he labeled children either highly reactive, which were inhibited, or low reactive, uninhibited. The others fell somewhere in between. Your inhibitive child would be that insecure, resistant child. And then the low reactive would be that secure child. And he says it's all about temperament, that their children, difficult children, are born that way. So Thomas and Chess, they're a married couple actually, did this long-term study, and they classified children this way according to their temperament. That easy, difficult, slow to warm up, and hard to classify. So easy, they're rhythmic, their disposition is good. Difficult, they're not rhythmic. In other words, they sleep at different times of the day, they're fussy, they might be even moody. Difficult types of children. Slow to warm up is, okay, when you bring them into a new situation, they might be difficult to start with, but then in time they become okay. And then here's the actual kind of breakdown of the different behaviors, temperaments. Trust versus mistrust. Trust is positive state of confidence, extends to those close and broader. It has to do with external and internal beliefs about the child's belief about adults, the child's belief about their self, their belief that adults will be there for them. So therefore the child feels safe and secure. The responses from the parent are not inconsistent or unpredictable. They're very predictable. So therefore adults become a safe haven. Mistrust is that the parent is probably not so reliable, not consistent in their interactions with the child. So the child becomes wary. Are they going to be warm to me? Are they going to be cold to me? Are they happy? Are they sad? So they're not quite sure if their needs are going to be met. And as a result, they don't feel lovable. I mean, I must not be worthy of care if this important person isn't going to care for me. And so they might withdraw and show signs of depression. The process is mutuality with caregiver. Mutual relaxation happens when there's a rhythm to so you look at the bottom, there's a rhythm to how things happen. And we regulate each other, which causes a relaxation. Synchrony just means when the child smiles, I smile back. Our behaviors match one another. When there's a mismatch, in other words, the child isn't getting what they want or the parent isn't getting what they want, then we need to repair that through communication and restoration. We'll see this with the still face experiment. And there's an oxytocin release, which is kind of the relationship type of hormone. And then, of course, hope is developed. We have hope and we feel like something is going to happen. Our goals and our dreams can be met, or we withdraw and we retract from other people and situations. So that ends this one, and I'm sorry that it ended up being so long.